Hi everyone. In this video, I will be leading us through the 2022-23 free application for federal student aid. This application is for students applying for aid for the 2022-23 academic year. We will complete this application as a dependent student, which means the student will have to provide parent information. To see if you are considered dependent or independent for the purposes of the FAFSA, please consult the link provided in the description box below. You'll want to start by visiting FAFSA.gov or FAFSA.gov, and you'll do this on one of the preferred browsers, so Google Chrome, Mozilla Firefox, or Apple Safari. You might want to clear the cache before starting. This will provide the best user experience. You'll start the application by clicking Start Here. Next, you'll select your role. For instance, if you select I am a student, then you will log in with your student FSA ID. We recommend that students create their FSA ID at least 3 days in advance of starting their FAFSA. This will allow enough time for processing. If you are a dependent and need to provide information about your parent or parents on the FAFSA form, one of your parents should create their own FSA ID if they have a Social Security number. If your parent does not have a Social Security number, there are other options that we will talk about later. So, you'll log in using your username and password. Next, you'll see a pop-up that informs you that you are completing an application that is shared with and monitored by the U.S. Department of Education only. I am going to hit Accept. And here's where you're going to select which FAFSA to complete. I am currently using the demo site in order to do this practice application with you. So I see the option to start a 2022-23 application or FAFSA form. Again, this is for students applying for aid for the 2022-23 academic year, typically fall 2022 and spring 2023. Students who plan to take college courses in the summer might need to reach out to their college to ask which application to complete. Which FAFSA you complete for summer semesters will vary from college to college, so it's important to just ask the college or university which FAFSA they need from you if you're going to be attending summer semester. Remember, you will complete a FAFSA each year that you'll be in college. A save key saves the progress of your application in case you don't finish the application in one sitting. It's between 4 and 8 characters that can be numbers or letters. So you could do something simple. And if you forget it, you can reset it. The application is saved for 45 days unless you submit the application for processing prior to that. Now you'll see a series of frequently asked questions and their answers, which we're going to skip over because hopefully I'll be able to answer all of those questions for you during today's demo. And now we'll start in student demographics. As you proceed through all of these sections of the FAFSA, if you're ever confused about if it's asking about the student or the parent, just pay attention to these banners at the top of the screen. It has already pulled over some of my personal information that's associated with my FSA ID. So in this case, I see the practice name, the practice date of birth, and the Social Security number already filled in. So I'm going to hit Continue. Here, you'll make sure to include an email address, and you'll want to use a personal email address and not an email address that could be changed or deactivated, such as an email that's attached to a student's high school or a workplace. You can also add a phone number. I'm going to do that here. And while not mandatory, it is beneficial for you to include an email address on the FAFSA form in order to receive important communications about your financial aid. When a student creates an FSA ID, adding and verifying an email address or a telephone number will make the account recovery process much easier if you ever need to unlock your account, retrieve a forgotten username, or reset a forgotten password. Next, you want to enter your permanent mailing address. So I'm going to do Aliceville, Alabama. It will ask you if you've lived in your state for at least 5 years. In this case, I'll say yes, but if you say no, it will then ask you what is your state of legal residence. But I am going to say yes. And then it asks for my citizenship status. So I can say, yes, I am a U.S. citizen or U.S. national. No, but I am an eligible non-citizen. The most common category of eligible non-citizen is that of a permanent resident or someone with a green card. But there are other categories as well, such as refugee or asylee. If you select no, but I am an eligible non-citizen, you will then have to provide your alien registration number. The third option is no, I am not a citizen or eligible non-citizen. In that case, you aren't eligible for federal student aid. However, if you've been granted DACA and have a social security number, you might complete the FAFSA to determine your eligibility for state or college aid, even if you aren't eligible for federal aid. But for this practice scenario, I'm going to select yes, I am a U.S. citizen. Next, we see high school completion status when beginning college in the 2022-23 school year. So if you are a high school senior, in this scenario, we'll say you have a high school diploma by the time you begin college in the 2022-23 school year. And then what college degree or certificate will you be working on when you begin that school year? If this is your first time going to college, it's important to answer this question correctly. So you could say, I'm going for a technical certificate, or I'm doing a 2-year associate's degree, or my first bachelor's degree. Next, it asks, will you have your first bachelor's degree before you begin that school year? So the answer is going to be no if I am a current high school senior, and it has already answered that for me. Then it will ask what my college grade level will be when I begin the school year. If you're a senior in high school at this very moment, you're going to say never attended college / first year. Even if you took things like dual enrollment or advanced placement classes and you have some college credits to your name on your transcript, what the FAFSA is really wondering here is, have you applied for or received federal financial aid for college education before? And as a high school senior, even if you did dual enrollment, the answer here is going to be no. So I'm going to say never attended college before / first year. And now it's going to ask if you're interested in work study. So there are these part-time jobs typically on the college campus that offer flexible work schedules and help you earn money to cover some of your educational expenses. If you're interested at all in working at least part-time during college, I recommend saying yes to this question here so that you can at least be considered for the pool of applicants for work-study jobs. Now, not all colleges or universities participate in work-study, so if you're wondering if the college that you're interested in participates, check with the financial aid office of that college. When the FAFSA asks, are you male or female, it's referring to the sex assigned at birth. So for this practice scenario, I'm going to choose female, but if I was filling out this FAFSA for somebody who was assigned male at birth, I would say male, and then it is going to ask if you are registered with the Selective Service System. So this used to be a requirement in order to receive federal financial aid. However, this requirement just recently changed, and while the selective service question still remains on the 2022-23 FAFSA, the answer to this question will no longer affect a student's aid eligibility. So you can say yes or no, and if you say no, it will ask if you want to register with the Selective Service right now. But for this scenario, I'm going to go back and put female. Now, driver's license is actually one of the questions that you can skip on the FAFSA. So if you don't have a driver's license, you don't have to put anything in here. But I would definitely recommend filling this out if you do have a driver's license. Now, the FAFSA will ask if you were a foster youth or if at any time you are in the foster care system. So I'm going to put no. And then it's going to ask for the highest school completed by parent 1 and parent 2 if applicable. So these are your biological or adoptive parents. And if you don't know the answer or you don't have contact with one or both of them, you can select other/unknown. I'm going to say my parents both completed high school. All right, we have finished the student demographics section, and now we're on to the school selection section. So we're first going to add our high school. So I'm going to pick one in Alabama. And when I click search, it came up with one option. If you get multiple options, please be sure that you select the correct high school. This is very important for your high school to be able to track its FAFSA completion. So I've made my selection, and I'm going to click continue. That information looks correct, so I will click continue again. All right, now we get to the college search. You can add up to 10 colleges and universities that you're considering, and each of those colleges will get a copy of your FAFSA information. So you can look up these colleges or universities by using the search feature. Or you can search by the school's federal school code if you know it. I'll say not many people will know the school code, so you can just search by state, city, and name. So you do have to put the state, and then the next two fields are optional. So I'm going to start by narrowing it down a bit. So it gives me two options here, and I meant this first one, so I'm going to check it and click continue. And if I click View College Info under the school name, I'm going to get a page with more details about the school. And this could be useful for you to read as you're considering and comparing colleges. but I'm going to close that out for now. For the sake of showing you how to add multiple schools, I'm going to click Add More Schools. So again, I'm going to do the same search process, and this time I'm going to search for Shelton. I'm going to check Shelton State Community College, and then click Continue. You can add up to 10 schools when first submitting the FAFSA. The order of those schools may affect your eligibility for state aid, so check the link in the description box to see if your state has any special requirements for the order. That link is also here directly on the FAFSA. For Alabama, the order does not matter. Okay, so those are the two colleges that I wanted to add. The FAFSA will ask for my housing plan for each of these colleges. And this doesn't necessarily affect how much aid you'll receive, but it will allow each college to better estimate your cost of attendance and your expected expenses. So it's important to answer this to the best of your ability so that the college can have an idea of your plans. But if you don't know yet, you can always give it your best guess. So at UNA, I'll say that I want to live on campus in the residence halls. And at Shelton, I would live off campus in an apartment. So school selection is done, and now we're moving on to dependency status, which is the section of the FAFSA that's going to determine whether or not you need to provide parental information. So the first question is, what is your marital status as of today? I'm going to say not married, so single, and click continue. Next, it asks about dependents. So, do you or will you have children who will receive more than half of your financial support between July 1st, 2022 and June 30th, 2023? So essentially, if you have or will have a baby of your own, a child of your own, that you're providing more than half of their financial support for, then you'll answer yes or no here. I'm going to say no. Or this question, do you have other dependents besides your own children or your spouse who live with you and who receive more than half of their support from you now and through June 30th, 2023? So if you're financially caring for a younger sibling, for example, but in this practice scenario, I'm going to say no. I don't have anyone who's living with me and relying on me financially. Now we go on to the remaining dependency questions. Are you currently serving on active duty in the U.S. Armed Forces for purposes other than training? Are you a veteran of the United States Armed Forces? At any time since you turned age 13, were both your parents deceased? Were you in foster care? Or were you a dependent or ward of the court? So, at any time since you turned age 13, were both of your parents deceased? At any time since you turned age 13, were you in foster care? Or at any time since you turned age 13, were you a ward or dependent of the court? Next, as determined by a court in your state of legal residence, are you or were you an emancipated minor? Next, does someone other than your parent or step-parent have legal guardianship of you, as determined by a court in your state of legal residence? Please note that legal guardianship is different from legal custody, and you should have paperwork or court documentation to prove this. So, by legal guardianship, we mean that it's court appointed. There's court documentation to back this up. So in this case, I'm going to say no, none of the above. The very last question that it will ask to determine your dependency status is on or after July 1st, 2021, were you homeless or were you self-supporting and at risk of being homeless? And the definition here is explained when we click this question mark. You may be homeless if you're living in shelters, parks, motels, hotels, public spaces, camping grounds, cars, abandoned buildings, or you're temporarily living with other people because you have nowhere else to go. Also, if you're living in any of these situations and fleeing an abusive parent, you might be considered homeless, even if your parent would otherwise provide a place to live. So, a reminder that whenever you're curious about how the FAFSA is defining a term, you can click these small question marks to get more detailed information. Now, if you are answering yes to this question, you will need documentation or a determination from one of the following entities listed here. So your high school or school district homeless liaison, the director of an emergency shelter or transitional housing program, the director of a runaway or homeless youth basic center or transitional living program. So keep that in mind. But for the purpose of this scenario, I'm going to click no. Okay, so the application has determined, based on the answers that I've provided, that I am a dependent student, which means I do need to provide parental information. So in this case, I'm going to show you what it looks like to provide parent information on the FAFSA. However, if you are determined to be a dependent student, but you're still truly incapable of getting your parents' information. So, for example, maybe you don't have contact with them anymore. This might be something where you can make an appeal with your college or university. So, I'm going to show you what that looks like if I click, I am unable to provide information about my parents, even though I am considered a dependent student. So, when I do that, the FAFSA will explain what will happen if I make this selection. So be sure to read these in detail. The FAFSA describes what is not considered a special circumstance, but the following are considered special circumstances. Your parents are incarcerated, you have left home due to an abusive family environment, you do not know where your parents are and are unable to contact them, and you have not yet been adopted. Or you are older than 21 but not yet 24, are unaccompanied, and are either homeless or self-supporting and at risk of being homeless. So those are considered special circumstances. These are not considered special circumstances. So you can say, I have a special circumstance and I am unable to provide parent information. If you do that, what you need to do is follow up with the College Financial Aid Office to discuss your specific situation. Now, if you select, I do not have a special circumstance and I am submitting my FAFSA form without parent information, your financial aid opportunities are going to be limited. You might only be able to apply for an unsubsidized loan. So just know that when you make these selections. Today, though, I am going to select, I will provide information about my parents. Okay, so we've moved on from dependency status, and we are now in the parent demographics section of the FAFSA. It's important to note that for the purposes of the FAFSA, a parent is a biological or adoptive parent or step-parent. You'll see that the application provides these different scenarios and then guides you on how to proceed. For instance, if your parents are divorced and you live with one more than the other, then you will report information about the parent you lived with more in the last 12 months. And if that parent is remarried, you'll report the information for their spouse as well. In the description box of this video, you'll find a flowchart called the Who's My Parent flowchart, and that will guide you through questions in sequence to determine whose information you need to report in the parent section. So the FAFSA provides different scenarios and guides you on whose information to provide. And then it will ask you, what is the marital status of your parents as of today? So literally, as of the moment you're filling out the FAFSA. Your options are never married, unmarried and both legal parents living together, married or remarried, divorced or separated, or widowed. So in this case, we're looking at the biological or adoptive parents. So if your parents are married as of today, pretty simple, pretty straightforward. But let's say your parents are divorced or separated as of today and do not live together. In that case, we need to figure out who is considered the parent for the purposes of the FAFSA. And remember, if we are looking at those scenarios on the screen before, it's going to guide you. And it requires you to report the parent that you've lived with more over the course of the last 12 months. So it cares more about the living situation. And if your situation is completely 50-50, so you're splitting your time evenly between parent 1 and parent 2, then you'll go with the parent who provides you more financial support. But again, that's a secondary thing. The first thing you want to look at is which parent do you live with more over the past 12 months. That's the parent you're required to report on for the FAFSA. If that person is still divorced or separated, so they're single today, then you would keep this answer and you would tell us when the divorce or separation happened, just the month and the year. However, if that parent has remarried, then you need to put remarried and then the month and year that they got remarried to their current spouse. And in that instance, you would list both the parent and that step parent's information. So again, revisit the scenarios that it lists on the page before or look at the flowchart in the description box. But for the purpose of this scenario, I'm going to put married and I'm going to put in October of 1989. Now it's going to ask the parent information, and it's going to start off with the first parent. So it's going to ask for their social security number, last name, first initial, date of birth, and email address. And it's going to ask this for parent 1 and parent 2. It doesn't matter who is parent 1 and who is parent 2. You get to pick, but you do need to be consistent throughout your application and make sure that if you choose them as parent 1, you're listing them consistently as parent 1 throughout the FAFSA. If your parent does not have a social security number, enter all zeros here. Do not enter an individual taxpayer identification number or ITIN here. If your parent does have a social security number, you must enter it carefully and correctly here. Okay, so we have completed the information for parent 1. Again, go ahead and note which parent you made parent 1 and which parent you're making parent 2. Okay, so we have put both parents in, and now it wants information about the parent's state of legal residence. So it asks if your parents lived in Alabama for at least 5 years. I'm going to say yes. And then we move on to other people in the household. So when the FAFSA is calculating your financial need, it's taking into account more than just your income. It's also taking into account how far does that money really go, right? So how many people are figuratively relying on your parents and how many of those people are in college? All of these things could impact your ability to pay for school. So I'm going to report my parents' other dependent children even if they're not physically living with us. So, as long as my parents are providing more than half of their financial support between July 1st, 2022 and June 30th, 2023, or those children could answer no to all of the dependency questions that we did earlier. And you can click the link to remind yourself those questions. But those questions were things like, are you married? Are you serving on active duty? Are you working on a master's degree? So in this case, I'll give a couple examples. A younger sibling, let's say a sixth grade sibling who's living at home, that person is going to be considered a member of the household. They're receiving more than half of their financial support from the parents. And then let's say we have an older brother who's maybe 20 and doesn't live in the house, but has answered no to all of the dependency questions on the FAFSA. We can also count him in the house. Even if he's living in the dorms, for example, and not physically living with the parents, they would still be considered two other dependent children. Now, we can also count other people in the household as long as they now live with the parents, if that living situation will persist, and then if my parents provide more than half of their support financially. So, for example, if grandma and grandpa are living at home and your parents take care of them by providing most of their financial support, then I would count grandma and grandpa as members of the household. In this case, though, I'm just going to say, no, nobody else lives in the household. And you can see that when I click continue, the application is adding up the numbers for me. So it's a household of 5 that includes me, the student, my parents, and then those two other siblings, the younger sibling that lives at home and the older sibling that's off at college. And then it asks, out of those 3 dependents, and then not including my parents, how many of those will be in college between July 1st, 2022 and June 30th, 2023? So I'm going to say 2 because I will be entering college and my brother's already in college. All right, now we've moved from the parent demographics section to the parent financials section. So for this application cycle, 2020 taxes are used. So the 2022-2023 FAFSA uses 2020 tax information. By this time, most people have already filed their 2020 taxes. So you can answer already completed, will file, or not going to file. If they say will file, then you're going to indicate what kind of tax return they plan on filing and what the filing status will be. When you do that, you will go through a process of estimating the numbers by using 2019 taxes, which will need to be updated after filing the 2020 tax return. Now, if you select not going to file, some people aren't required to file taxes. For instance, you don't have to start filing a federal income tax return until you meet a specific threshold by having a certain level of income. So some people will not file a tax return. But for today's scenario, I'm going to say that we have already completed the return. Most folks will be filing an IRS Form 1040. However, if your parents filed a foreign tax return, you can put that. If they filed a tax return with Puerto Rico, a U.S. territory, or freely associated state, they can put that. I'm going to put the Form 1040. And then it will ask for the filing status on the 2020 return. These are the little boxes at the top of the 1040. I'll click this question mark so that you can see on the application, the FAFSA will provide screenshots of the tax forms you'll be referencing, and they'll highlight exactly where you need to look to find the information. So I'll look at my tax return and know that my parents filed a married filed joint return. Now, there's a tool that allows you to import tax information directly from the IRS. It's called the IRS Data Retrieval Tool, or DRT. And if you want to use it and can use it, we encourage you to, because it saves you time, it saves you effort, and it potentially saves you from having to provide additional information to your college. So you can click Proceed to the IRS, and then you'll be prompted to log in with a parent FSA ID. And you'll select which parent you are, and then you'll log in with the parent FSA username and password. Now remember, for dependent students, both the student and the parent should create their own separate FSA ID. If the parent, though, does not have a social security number, they will not be able to do this. But for a parent who does have a social security number, they should have their own FSA ID. So they'll enter that username and password. If they need to create an FSA ID now, they can start that process. Now, because this is a practice FAFSA, I'm not going to be able to show you what this looks like because there's no actual tax return to pull from the IRS. But if you do utilize this tool, what you'll see is once you've successfully entered your username and password, you'll be sent over to the IRS website. You'll then have to validate your identity by typing in your address exactly as it appears on your federal tax return. And it is very, very picky here. So you'll want to have your tax forms in front of you, and you'll want to type out the address exactly as it appears on the return so that it is able to match the information and pull that tax information over into the FAFSA so that you don't have to do everything manually. Then once you come back to the FAFSA after successfully using the tool, you'll see that fields have already been transferred from the IRS. But because we're not able to demonstrate this tool because we're doing a practice application, I'm going to select Skip IRS DRT and complete manually. So the first question, what was your parents' adjusted gross income for 2020? And it's going to tell you exactly which line to look at. So we're looking at the IRS Form 1040, line 11. Again, if we click the question mark, then we'll get a pop-up, and that pop-up will show us exactly where we need to look on the tax return. So in this practice scenario, I'm going to say the adjusted gross income was $45,000. Now it's going to ask about parent income from work, so how much they earned from wages, salaries, and tips. Even if you used the IRS data retrieval tool, if you have two parents on your FAFSA, it's going to ask you to type out what parent 1 made from working versus what parent 2 made from working. And this can be kind of frustrating because you've just used the data retrieval tool, but if you ever look at a married filing joint tax return, you'll notice that it actually doesn't really clearly delineate what the two separate earners made from working. It groups that information together. So a couple of ways that you can separate this out is by looking at your parents' separate W-2s and other income documents if you have them, Or you can look at Schedule W-2 on the Alabama state return if your parents filed a state tax return during 2020. So the Schedule W-2 will break down earnings by each taxpayer, and so you can see based on the Social Security number of the parent, whose W-2 is whose, and that might help you break it down, at least for line 1 of the IRS Form 1040. Then you'll need to also break it down by Schedule 1 and Schedule K1. Now, some of these schedules that are referenced when completing the FAFSA might not apply to your family, so you might not have these forms. So for this example, I'm going to do a fairly simple breakdown and say that parent 1 made $20,000, parent 2 made $25,000. And it's important to follow the equation that's listed on the screen. So it's going to tell you exactly what it's looking for. IRS Form 1040, line 1, plus Schedule 1, lines 3 and 6. And then box 14, code A of Schedule K1 or Form 1065. So we're going to add all those figures together to determine what parent 1 made from working and what parent 2 made from working. Next, it's going to ask you about Schedule 1 specifically. If your parents don't have a Schedule 1, then you're going to say no here. But if your parents do have a Schedule 1, and it's not just filed to report unemployment compensation, educator expenses, IRA deduction, student loan interest deduction, or Alaska Permanent Fund dividend, then you'll answer yes. You'll also be asked if either parent is a dislocated worker, and this has a very specific definition that you can find when you click the question mark. So you can see if any of those apply. And after you answer that, it's going to ask if in 2020 or 2021, did you, your parents, or anyone in your parents' household receive benefits from any of the federal benefits programs listed below? These are going to include things like Medicaid, SSI, SNAP, free or reduced price lunch, TANF, or WIC. So I'm going to say none of the above. Next, we're going to enter the amount of your parents' income tax for 2020. Again, read this very carefully because we're only looking for the 1040 line 22. And then if you have Schedule 2, again, you might not have this schedule. If there's anything inside of line 2, we're going to subtract that from the 1040 line 22. So if you don't have a Schedule 2, then we're just going to pay attention to the 1040 line 22. And I'm going to say 0 here. Next up, did your parents have any of the following items in 2020? So if your parents received combat pay, you're going to put that here. If your parents are in college and they receive student grants and scholarship aid reported to the IRS, I'm going to put that here. If your parents claimed education credits on their taxes, so these are things like the American Opportunity Credit or Lifetime Learning Credit, they'll have a Schedule 3 attached to their tax return, and we're going to look at line 3. Again, if there's no Schedule 3 attached to your tax return, you can skip that part. Next up, untaxed portions of IRA distributions and pensions. We're going to look at your tax return, so the 1040, and we're going to look at lines 4A and 5A, minus lines 4B and 5B, and we're going to exclude rollovers. Again, if those lines on your tax return are blank, that's going to be a 0 here. Next up are things like IRA deductions, which we're going to look at the tax return Schedule 1 to find this. You might not have Schedule 1, but if you do, if there's anything on lines 15 and 19, we want to report that here. And then finally, tax-exempt interest income from the 1040 line 2A. Again, if you ever get stuck on any of these questions or you need more detail about what it's asking, you can click the little question mark and it will give you additional details, and it will also show you exactly where to look on your tax return. All right. Next up, we have things that we cannot find on the tax return. So this is information your parents will either have or not have. They'll know if the situation applies to them. Again, we're looking for these items in 2020. So first up, if your parents paid child support, they're going to put that amount here. If they had earnings from work under a cooperative education program offered by a college, they'll report that here. And then if your parents are in college and they had a work-study job or need-based employment, portions of fellowships or assistantships, they're going to put those earnings here. So again, we're looking for the following items in 2020. If your parents are receiving child support, they're going to put that here. If they're receiving housing, food, or other living expenses as a member of the military or a member of the clergy, they're going to put that here. Next, we have payments to tax-deferred pension and retirement savings plans, including, but not limited to, amounts reported on the W-2 form in boxes 12A through 12D, codes D, E, F, G, H, and S. Don't include any amounts reported in the code DD. So it's important to look at the parents' W-2 forms to check boxes 12A through 12D for any of these codes. Next, if your parents are receiving veterans non-education benefits such as disability, death pension, or DIC, and or VA educational work-study allowances, you'll put that amount here. And then lastly, we'll put other untaxed income not reported, such as workers' compensation or disability benefits. Please note that if you click the question mark, it specifies that we do not want to include things like untaxed Social Security benefits or SSI. FAFSA will ask about your parents' assets, and you'll either see an option to skip the question, or like here, you'll see a dollar amount that will depend on the answers you've provided on the previous screens. So here I see $4,900. So as of today, does the total amount of your parents' current assets exceed $4,900? If we say yes, we'll be able to see exactly what the categories of assets are for the FAFSA, and we'll be able to see if those in total exceed $4,900. So it first asks, as of today, what is your parents' total current balance of cash, savings, and checking accounts? We'll enter that amount here. So we'll say it's $1,000. As of today, what is the net worth of your parents' investments, including real estate, but not including your parents' home? If we click the question mark, we'll see what else is considered to be investments. So investments include things like mutual funds, stock options, bonds, and many other items. So again, always be sure to click the question mark to find more details. Lastly, as of today, what is the net worth of your parents' current businesses and/or investment farms? Don't include a family farm or family business with 100 or fewer full-time or full-time equivalent employees. So, as of today, if I've accounted for all of the assets and it's only 1,000, then my parents' current assets do not exceed $4,900, so I can answer no here. Remember, you might not see an amount here. You might be presented with the option to skip questions about assets, and if that's the case, feel free to skip. We'll click continue. So we've moved from parent financials to student financials. So now we're no longer being asked questions about the parents, we're being asked questions about the student. So it's going to ask if the student has completed a 2020 income tax return. And so for students who are working part-time, some of them might not meet the federal income tax filing requirement and don't have to file taxes. They might simply be filing a federal income tax return just to be able to receive a refund of their withholding. But for the purposes of this example, we'll say that the student is not going to file, that even though they worked part-time, they didn't make enough to have a filing requirement. So we'll say they made $300 in wages throughout 2020. And then it's going to ask us the same questions about financial aspects for the student that it did for the parents. So I'm going to go through this quickly since we've already gone through it with the parents. We're going to say that the student does not have any of these items. And so we get to the question about assets. So we'll say that the student has $50 in savings and no investments, no businesses. And now we get to the FAFSA summary page. So we're going to see a summary of the information that we've entered for the entire application in a nice, neat, clean form so you can kind of read through, make sure that everything is accurate. This looks pretty similar to the student aid report that the student will receive after submission. So as long as everything looks good, we're going to go all the way to the bottom and click continue. So in the sign and submit section, we want to read before proceeding. We'll be agreeing to the terms outlined here. We're also going to certify that all of the information is true and complete to the best of our knowledge. And then we will sign the FAFSA form. So here as the student, we have signed electronically with our FSA ID. Remember, dependent students will also need to provide the signature of one of their parents. So they will also need to agree to the terms and then sign with their FSA ID if they have one. I mentioned earlier that if your parent doesn't have a social security number, they're not going to be able to create an FSA ID. So what you want to do in that circumstance is when you get to this parent signature page, you're going to click provide signature. And of course, they'll agree to the same terms. After they have agreed to the terms, If they don't have an FSA ID because they don't have a social security number, then they're going to click Other Options to sign and submit. Then they will click Print a Signature Page, and they'll click this Print Signature Page. It will pop up. They'll print, sign, date, and then mail to the address that is listed. And that's how the parent will sign and submit the form if they do not have an FSA ID because they don't have a social security number. But if the parent does have a social security number and is therefore able to create an FSA ID, they can sign electronically exactly as the student did. There's going to be an option right here that says Submit My FAFSA Form Now. You want to make sure to click that in order to actually submit your FAFSA to the Department of Education for processing. And then that's it. It will say congratulations. So once you've hit that submit button, you will get a confirmation screen. They'll also email a confirmation to the email address that you put on file when you started the application. A little bit further down, they will tell you the estimated expected family contribution, as well as the estimated eligibility information. And that's it. We recommend to check your email regularly to see if there's any follow-up information you need to provide. Additionally, you can consult the What Happens Next resource that's linked in the description box below. But that's all. Congratulations on submitting your FAFSA. Thanks for watching.